Hey there, friends, and welcome back to the video lecture series. This is Unit 9. We're going to discuss, of course, dairy cattle feeding programs, Chapter 9 in your text, and I'm sure you're all rigorously reading that textbook. Some good stuff in there. I make fun. Some good stuff that will help back up the content that we have here. Just some quick objectives. We're, of course, going to go through the life cycle different feeding programs for dairy cattle. You'll see a lot of different stages that we'll talk about here. More extensive than some of the other species. Talk, of course, about nutrient needs, how we balance those out, feed additives where appropriate, and I will add in here and sprinkle in some disease and disorder things. There's not a lot of them mentioned in the slide deck, frankly, hardly any. So take good notes as we go because I'll try and pop those in there where appropriate as we talk about where we can really get in trouble from disease perspective as it relates to dairy cattle feeding. So the first part of the slide deck is, of course, and the majority of it's going to focus on feeding lactating dairy cattle. And so how do we talk about feeding for milk production? And I've got to give you a little bit of historical perspective here. As we go back through time, of course, most of our feeding programs were based upon pasture. And so, we may be fed a little bit of grain as they discovered that grain feeding did have a positive correlation with higher milk production. We started to introduce different grains into the diet. Then as you get into the, let's say, 40s through about the 1990s, you saw, of course, an increasing amount of confinement at different styles, whether they were tie stall facilities or freestall facilities, kind of a bedded pack or loafing barn type facilities where we would do what I would call component or buffet feeding. So corn silage may be offered in one location or bunk, hay fed in a hay ring or a hay bunk, your grain perhaps fed in the tie stall facility or in the parlor or both, and things of that nature. And then, of course, now we've evolved to a more confinement freestall type setup for the majority of the industry where feed is presented in what we call a total mixed ration or TMR. So all your corn silage, all your haylage, all your grains, all your dry hay mixed up in one great big blender and then delivered all at one time. It's important to note as we talk about some general keys that the lactating dairy cow requirements are 3 to 4 times that of the maintenance requirement. So substantially higher protein and carbohydrate density needed in order to support that high milk production. So what's influencing the type of feeding system that we utilize today? And of course that is absolutely tied to what we're trying to do from a production standpoint on the farm. You can clearly go out and find pasture-based dairies, and nothing wrong with that. And of course, if we are trying to maximize that, then we put a feeding program together that matches that carefully. If we're more confinement, then we're going to put a feeding program together that matches that. But it's all driven by producer preference and what's most profitable for them. And feed, and why we will focus on it so much, feed is 50% of the cost of production at least all the time. And that's the determining factor often in high milk production rates or optimal milk production rates. Now, certainly genetics, facilities, management, health, a whole bunch of other things come into play. But feed is going to be the driving and determining factor in so much of milk production success. You've heard me harp a number of times throughout the semester as we talked about forages, that forage quality drives profitability, and it is no more true anywhere than dairy cattle feeding. Forage is the foundation for everything, every ration that we put together, and so it's the critical base, and the quality is absolutely essential. We've talked about how to make good forages already, so I won't belabor that point anymore, but absolutely make good quality feed, because if you don't and you make poor quality feed, you're stuck with it. We got to figure out how to feed it and get rid of it, because there's really no substituting. If you've got terrible quality corn silage, there's really no way to get better quality corn silage. There's some substitution rates here. So for example, if you're feeding hay and want to put some corn silage in, kind of the rule of thumb is about 3 pounds of corn silage for every pound of hay if you're substituting things in and out. And if you allow cows to just graze on pasture, they will actually consume a lot more forage than what we would typically feed them in silage intake. So they'll go ahead and eat a lot more feed out on pasture. So, and there's some benefits to that. So um, especially of course if you're a pasture-based dairy. So forage quality, bottom line, forage quality, absolutely key. It'll make you more profitable. A few other things here as we talk about ration tips before we get into some more specifics. There's a lot of variation in protein content and quality, and it's much greater in forages than concentrates. Most of your concentrates are really relatively consistent, crude protein, energy, etc. Forages are all over the board. We will, of course, use book values or what's in the feed library whenever we go to put together our case study rations. And that's fine. That's a fine place to start. But if you're doing this in practice, you absolutely need to be testing your forages and getting accurate nutrient levels of each of those key things. Some important nutrient measures, and I hate to make a list, but you guys like those things. And of course, we're going to really hone in on dry matter intake, net energy for lactation, crude protein, digestible and ruminant undegradable protein fractions, amino acid, calcium, phosphorus, etc. There is a lot of different things that we can manipulate from a mineral and vitamin content and interaction perspective that can have substantial impacts. And I'm talking about health status, I'm talking about hoof hardness, a few different things that go along with that. And I want to get this out there, and please put this in the back of your mind for the rest of the unit. 50-50 forage concentrate ratio when we talk about lactating dairy cow rations. And it, of course, depends on the farm. But if you can keep it around 50-50 forage to concentrate, your cows and your rumens will be healthy. Now, can we go higher concentrate than that or higher forage than that? Absolutely. Especially if you're a pasture-based dairy, you're going to be maybe 70 to 85% forage. Now, and that's fine. You're going to supplement a little bit of grain. Your cows will perform likewise. Can you go above 60% concentrate? I would warn you against that. Can it be done? Yes, for short periods of time. But I would warn you against that because, and here comes some of your diseases, high levels of grain feeding really affect the rumen in a negative way. We cause low pHs, which causes diseases like acidosis, displaced abomasum, laminitis in the feet. We get all kinds of bad things, ulcers happening whenever we feed too high a level of concentrate. So that rumen pH needs to be maintained between 5.8 and let's say 6.3 or so in order to keep the rumen bug population healthy. Whenever we drop and feed too many concentrates and we drop the rumen pH below let's say 5.8, we're going to start to cause a lot of negative impacts. Digestibility will go terribly south. Cow health will go really sideways, and you'll start to see losses in milk production and a whole bunch of other associated things that you'll have to treat with your veterinarian. So keep it around 50-50 when we talk about lactating dairy cow rations. There will be times to feed more forage, but think 50-50 and we'll start from there. So how about feeding concentrates? Well, what influences intake as we talk about using concentrate feeds? Of course, palatability. There are a number of different feeds that we will try and stuff into dairy cow rations that are needed, but they're not particularly palatable. So we have to utilize those carefully. Think about time of feed access. It's a great management practice to have fresh piles of feed laying there whenever the cows come back from the milking parlor. They'll eat a lot right then, and so you want to make sure that there's lots of feed available. Refusal rates, we want to have piles of feed there 24 hours a day basically, and only let them eat it down to about 1% to perhaps 3% left. So 1 to 3% refusal. I say target the right cow. We want to push the high-end producers as hard as we can without overfeeding the low-end ones and making it too expensive for them. So grouping cows is going to be more accurate. I'm going to talk about some grouping strategies later on in this video series. Grains, milled feeds, byproducts, supplements, etc. Utilize those carefully. We're gonna really try and match those to the forage program that we have. So that selection is really carefully done. And of course, we're going to consider availability and cost. And then those concentrate feeding levels are going to be dictated by the forage feeding rate, our milk production, and milk component performance that we have coming out of our cows. So, a little bit on some technique here as we put together some steps in ration balancing. First, establish your needs. Go investigate what kind of ration we need to build, and so we know what the nutritional need is. Determine your available feeds, both forage and concentrates. That's pretty simple most of the time. Establish some baseline feeding levels. So when we build our rations in Spartan ration balancing program, push that corn silage, dry hay, alfalfa haylage, whatever, push it to about 50% or so of what the predictor says that they will eat. Start there. Then add your dry corn, high moisture corn, soybean meal, etc. Get your ration balanced for some of the metrics that I mentioned here. And then go back and recheck. It's great practice. Once you think you have your ration balanced, just sit back, check it out, think about it for a second. Think about if they'll eat it. Think about if it will mix well. Think about if the producer will be able to put it together the way that you suggest it should be done. And then, of course, as always, I'm a big fan of analyzing cost. Some grouping strategies or feeding guidelines. And this will preview the second segment that's going to come along here with Unit 9. And of course, think about stage of lactation. Feeding guidelines and nutritional needs change based upon how far along that they are in milk production from calving towards the end of their lactation. It's about a 305-day window, give or take a few days. So their nutritional needs change over that time. So we're going to think about that stage of lactation. Lactation status, so whether they're kind of at peak milk production or whether they're first lactation cows, or older cows, like we talk about age. Sometimes that affects the ration guideline that we want to put together. So grouping strategies are important. We're going to dive into that more in the second segment here. Thought I might suggest a good break time, milk and cookies. We'll come back with segment 2.